Public Affairs very much thanks Residco, our sole corporate underwriter, for helping to make the production of this show possible.
Another option is a Chapter 9 prepackaged bankruptcy. And bankruptcy sounds terrible. I understand what city would ever want to go bankrupt, but there is a way to do this in a form where it's organized all before it's filed. Deals are made, and the filing only occurs when basically there's a plan that's agreed on and it's ready to be executed, and you can have a relatively quick, we call it prepackaged or prearranged bankruptcy that doesn't overly hurt the city, its image, its rankings. It's not a fun thing.
You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. There are pension liabilities for the state of Illinois, for the city of Chicago, and around the state. You total it all up, we'll go toward this number. WirePoint says, at least I take their data and work with it, about $260 billion in unfunded pension liabilities, about $250 billion. You think I have that about right, James Sprayregen?
You have that correct. It's about $250 billion.
Way back when you came to Kirkland Ellis in 1990, I don't think there was a bankruptcy process there. You practice there, but you created that. That was a process of taking it. You were there till it was some time off for good behavior till just last year. Now you're at Hilco Global. Now you're Vice-Chairman of the board. But all of your life, I mean, you're too modest when you say, well, you're not. Then it's a political process. But you were doing what was political within that corporate community, with the creditors, with the debtors, with the judges, with the various other counsel. Isn't that really a political negotiation process?
Whatever you want to call it, the way I say is you need to be proactive in the restructuring world and the bankruptcy world. Best way to avoid bankruptcy is to be ready to do it. And leadership matters. You need to have a vision for what you want to accomplish. You need a set of strategy and tactics. You need flexibility because it'll never happen exactly the way you say. Whether that's in the private sector or the public sector, to me, all that applies. And unfortunately, restructuring is a contact sport. And you need to get in the arena and engage to be able to be in a position to even hope to solve the problem. Right now, there's lack of engagement.
So James Sprayregen, he is the #1 guy. He is the Mick Jagger of restructuring, of bankruptcy, however you want to put it, worldwide, #1. So we are blessed to have him as an expert. Most, if not all of his time is on the private sector, but guess what? I think there are some major analogies here of his work to the public sector, to government stuff. So he's dealing with these distressed companies worldwide, but we have a distressed government, the state of Illinois, primarily the city of Chicago, but also cities around the state of Illinois. Anything I've said that got that wrong?
That's all correct.
When you find there's a distressed company and they come to you, what do you do? Give us an overview.
Simplistically, I help solve problems. These are situations where what you're talking about, unfortunately with the Illinois pension problem, where promises have been made and they may not be able to be kept to pay various people certain amounts of money over certain periods of time. And I come in and I help resolve those problems and make deals.
And so United Airlines, you did work for them, right?
I represented them in their bankruptcy and restructuring over a period of 6 or 7 years.
And did it start with them filing a bankruptcy, or would it start with them coming to you and say, we've got a problem, we're distressed, what do you advise, sir?
Much more of the former. They came to me, unfortunately, shortly after 9/11, so that was an unusual problem. But that wasn't the real problem at United Airlines. It actually was pensions and a number of other problems. But yes, I probably represented them for almost 2 years before they filed for Chapter 11.
And when they are bankrupt, what's the definition of being bankrupt?
Either you can't pay your debts as they come due, or you have more liabilities than assets.
Okay, and you can be moving toward that process, but when you file, you're in there. You are bankrupt usually. Is that right?
There's an old saying of how did you go bankrupt? And it's first gradually and then suddenly.
Okay, and the person who files is known in the world as the debtor. Is that
As
right?
the debtor in possession also.
And they're the creditors out there, creditor committees,
In all different kinds of creditors, depends on the case.
and all people, the various individuals have counsel to the creditors, and there are creditor committees that form to deal with the debtor. There's the judge at some point gets involved. There's the courtroom. There's the out of the courtroom finagling that goes on, and hopefully a plan emerges at some point, and the judge has to approve that plan, right?
All basically correct. There's usually a number of other professionals too, financial advisors, investment bankers, et cetera. But basically that's how it would work.
And people take haircuts. You know, the bondholders take haircuts. They're not going to get 100 cents on the dollar. Sometimes they may be lucky if they get 50 cents on the dollar, right?
Depends on the situation, but correct.
Same thing with the pension liabilities. They're going to take a haircut as well, right?
It depends on the situation, but it happens in a number of cases where unfortunately that happens for the pensioners.
So give people an idea, when you were working with United Airlines, roughly what were the to start with, the pension liabilities that they had to be adjusted?
Well, United had probably 25 billion plus in regular debt, commercial debt, call it, and tens of billions of dollars in pension obligations over a period of many decades to over 100,000 retirees. And if you added in all their dependents, it was many hundreds of thousands of people. So order of magnitude, there was, dozens and dozens of billions of dollars involved between the creditors and the pensioners.
Okay, you've done, I don't know, dozens, maybe 100 major bankruptcies over the years.
Multiple
right?
hundreds.
Multiple hundreds. Conseco, that was another major bankruptcy you worked on.
That's correct.
What was the order of magnitude there with liabilities that had to be adjusted?
50 plus billion.
Okay, so big numbers, and the secret here, I guess, is that to give people an idea, where we start with, if we start with Chicago, we're going to try to say Chicago has some options here. There's a problem, but they better start dealing with it. And if we break that up, when you say Chicago and Illinois has some options, the city of Chicago and the other cities have options. We focus on Chicago because it's so big relative to other cities. But if we talk about this process of bankruptcy or adjustment, it would involve Chicago, but it most likely would involve cities around the state, right?
The situation that a number of instrumentalities of government in Illinois is in is very difficult. But to me, the good news is there's actually solutions that can help resolve the problem, not with no pain, but with hopefully as little pain as possible. I'm sure we're going to get into that. But this is not a hopeless situation at all.
Right, and same thing on the state. We'll get that. We'll deal with the city issues, city of Chicago, other cities, and then we'll deal with the state. The state is a little more complicated as to how that would be analogous to the bankruptcy process, right?
That's correct, and I wouldn't say just other cities. Chicago has, the teachers have a pension, firefighters have a pension, so there's other formal entities that owe the pensions in addition to the city of Chicago.
Right, because the city, when I talk about it, I'm talking about their total pension liabilities, but there are 5 major categories. You've just ticked off some of those. And these are pension funds, they have fiduciaries, they're almost an entity unto themselves, right? And they have interests that...
More than almost, they are.
They are, and those individuals have interests. So we've got police, we've got fire, we've got what they call laborers, we've got teachers, we've got what's called the municipal fund. So these 5 funds, and they've just, the one thing they have in common, they've all gotten worse over time. Right?
Substantially worse.
So I mean, we started like a decade ago with about city adding up all those funds. There were $29 billion in pension shortfall, unfunded liability. That's now grown to what, about $53 billion?
Almost double.
Almost double. And so if they start now, bad as the problem is, be a lot easier than if they start 5 years later, right?
I'd say a lot less hard, never easy.
Never easy. Okay. And so, and these things, ideally, the actuaries would say they should be fully funded, 100% funded. That means they have assets that will generate the revenue to pay the pensions as they come due, if they're 90% or 100% funded, right?
Goal is 100% funding, yes.
Yeah, and so if we look at this now, we see that pensions and teachers' unions about 40, a little bit more than 40%, police 22%, firefighters 22%, and these numbers, labor and municipal funds somewhere in between. So over the last decade, they've all declined. I was reading off the numbers they currently are at, but they were much better. They were maybe 90%, some of these funds, 80%, 60% 10 years ago.
Yeah,
But they're just getting worse and worse. Why is that?
The funding levels, unfortunately, have plummeted, partly because the obligations have increased. The returns have been okay, not terrible, but not at the top level of some other states around the country. And there's a significant COLA, cost of living adjustment, that occurs on most pensions in the state of Illinois and city of Chicago that cause the pensions to continue to increase. There's a number of other provisions that are very favorable to increasing the pension obligations. So there's a plethora of factors, but basically not enough funding and lots of growth in the obligations.
Yeah, promising too much, more than they could reasonably do, maybe above market, if there was a comparable market for what people would get in the private sector. Of course, most of the private sector firms have gotten out of this business. They don't do defined benefits anymore, right?
The private sector has, for the most part, moved away from defined benefits. I would say, and I think this is quite important, because these promises are made to individual people who've worked very hard for decades in whatever their jobs are in whatever governmental entity, and they were promised these pensions, and for whatever reason, these pensions weren't funded. So making promises without funding is problematic.
But how many years, if you look at how many years do you have that you could cover of, if you look at the amounts you're going to have to pay out each year, if you had 8 years, that's one thing. If you had 4 years, 3.5 years, that means in 3.5 years you're out, right?
That's what the numbers would show. In real life,
unless you change the situation of contributions, et cetera.
There's, not unfortunately, fortunately, I guess I'd say, there's generally some ways to buy more time, but that's more in the nature of kicking the can down the road rather than addressing the problem.
So in Chicago, the firefighters fund, it's about 3.5 years. They've got 3.5 years and then they're out. And the teachers is about 8 years, and the other funds are in between. And in Los Angeles, they've got 20, the ratio is 20 times.
Yes.
So they're actually in pretty good shape, certainly relative to Chicago.
On a relative basis,
yeah,
yes.
Right. And another way to look at it is, I mean, Chicago's a leader in being worst in almost all of these categories. We'll see that's what holds that in common. Because when you look at their fixed costs, which is their amount they would pay for pensions, no matter what happens, you've got to cover that. And you have a budget. Chicago's got a budget about $16 billion. There's a lot of discretion, might be painful, but to cut other things. But the pensions are the pensions, right? There's a statute that says how much they have to pay, and their actuaries would say they should be paying more. But those are kind of, accurate say those are fixed costs.
Yeah, this is the reality and the problem, and the growing problem, that these pension obligation payments crowd out the ability of the government, City of Chicago, for example, to be able to pay and service other essential services that city residents need. Simplistically, police, fire, emergency, infrastructure, sewage, whatever you can think of, cultural events.
Right. I mean, they've got education costs. They share that with the state. The cities do. They've got human services. They share that, I guess, with the state. They have, of course, we just mentioned the pensions, health care, but if you're covering the pensions and they balloon, you're going to have less for education, less for crime, taking care of crime, police, less for all these things. So that's the crowd out you're talking about, right?
There used to be a saying about General Motors before they went bankruptcy that they were a healthcare company masquerading as a car company because so much of their costs went to service healthcare and pensions.
All right. So, and then people say, well, why don't you just raise taxes? Why isn't that a problem? I mean, a solution, because hey, if you need more revenue, the city can raise taxes, state can raise taxes. Why not?
Well, you mentioned Illinois being a leader. Illinois is a leader in loss of population also, and people are not bound to live in the state of Illinois. And if taxes continue to be raised, people will vote with their feet. Not everybody, but there's already been an exodus from both the city and the state. And the idea that you can just keep raising taxes to solve the problem doesn't sound realistic to me.
Right. I think we say in Illinois, I think they may be the highest property taxes across the country. Chicago's property taxes are going up faster than inflation, 3.5 times as fast as inflation. So, in fact, just recently, people who follow this know that Mayor Brandon Johnson was going to raise property taxes, and he backed off completely, right? Looked for other sources of revenue. And even that was tough. He was looking, well, nickel and dime him to death, so to speak. And as you pointed out, so Chicago's been losing population. They're the only major cities to lose population in the last 20 years, Chicago and Detroit, right? Everybody else gaining population. We're not losing major amounts, but if others are gaining and we're losing, our proportionate, the representation of Illinois and Chicago, Illinois in particular, has gone down, right? We not too long ago had 22 representatives in Congress. Now we've got 17.
Detroit should be the canary in the coal mine for Chicago. Chicago is nowhere near in the dire situation that Detroit is in, but Detroit wasn't at some point in time too, and they didn't address their issues. They lost massive population. Their tax base collapsed. They were unable to service everything, and ultimately they went into bankruptcy, what's called Chapter 9, municipal bankruptcy. And they went into it on death's doorstep as distinct from strategically. They weren't able to address or organize themselves to have deals with anybody to really address their problems on a proactive strategic basis as distinct from just collapsing into a Chapter 9 bankruptcy.
And there are rating agencies that rate these things, right? Moody's, Fitch, S&P. And right now, the one thing they have in common is that Chicago and Detroit are the outliers. And sometimes, and actually Chicago's below Detroit in some of these ratings. And they're both very close to what's known as junk status, right? Which isn't good.
Even though the general public doesn't think about the pension problem every day, the rating agencies, when they're rating debt that is being put out by the state of Illinois, city of Chicago, and other governmental entities, very much looks at what these pension obligations are and all of the issues we've been talking about. What's going to happen, what's going to give crowding out of being able to pay money for interest on the debt, but also for essential city services. The rating agencies look at all those things. And unfortunately, Chicago is the best at being the worst. They're worse rated than Detroit right now. The only reason for that is Detroit went through bankruptcy and adjusted their debts. And that's why they're a little bit marginally better at this point.
And there are cities that are way better, cities like Boston or Charlotte or Columbia, Denver, so forth. And there's a range. There's some that are in between. But the point is, government matters, right? Because governments make decisions that either end up with your ratings when you want to acquire more debt. You're paying more.
There's a lot of perspective for Chicago to be able to address these problems if they are taken head on and addressed by the stakeholders, hopefully in the relatively near future.
If Brandon Johnson were sitting here, what would you advise him to do to start dealing with some of these problems?
Well, I would tell you in my 40 years of doing bankruptcies and restructurings and representing hundreds of companies and other stakeholders in these situations, The biggest problem has always been the lack of will to address issues before you're on death's doorstep. Another old saying is denial is not only a river in Egypt. And many situations I've been in, I've been called way later than I should have. So if I was called today, I would recommend, most importantly, to exercise the political will to say this is a problem, it needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, and gather the various stakeholders around a table and talk truth to power and use the real numbers and talk about what the solutions may be. And there are a variety of solutions.
What are they? On the city side, the municipal side, what, if you were starting to outline the solutions for them, what would they be?
Well, one solution.
Thinking big,
Sure.
so to speak.
One solution, obviously, people have suggested is raise taxes to cover the looming pension problems. Obviously, the recent activity with being unable to raise property taxes and the outcry against that is illustrative of that's a tough option. So I don't regard that as a viable option in the mid to long term. Another option is a Chapter 9 prepackaged bankruptcy. And bankruptcy sounds terrible. I understand what city would ever want to go bankrupt, but there is a way to do this in a form where it's organized all before it's filed. Deals are made, and the filing only occurs when basically there's a plan that's agreed on and it's ready to be executed, and you could have a relatively quick, we call it prepackaged or prearranged bankruptcy that doesn't overly hurt the city, its image, its rankings. It's not a fun thing, but in terms of getting over the hump and addressing the pension problems, that is a way to go about it. Third, probably the best answer, is to be in a position and have the political will and willingness to do option 2, but negotiate with everybody what we call out of court and make deals that can be implemented out of court such that you never need to go the bankruptcy option. But you need to build the leverage, not in some pejorative, negative, baseball bat kind of way, but the leverage to get people to focus the mind, to be willing to compromise, because one way or the other, there's going to be a compromise here because these obligations aren't able to be serviced under the current revenue and cost projections. So something's going to give at some point, and my point is it would be better to bring it on now and address the issues rather than waiting until we're Detroit.
Right, and so some of the folks representing police, fire, the 5 groupings here, labor, the teachers, the municipal funds, those funds would say, well, look, we're aware that some cities have the power to file for bankruptcy, but folks, you in Chicago don't. They don't have that. None of the cities have that power in the state of Illinois, right?
Currently, under the legal regime that exists, Chicago couldn't do what I said. They couldn't file or threaten to file a Chapter 9. Why is that? Because under the way the law works, the Illinois legislature either needs to give general authority to cities to file Chapter 9 or specific authority for something like Chicago because of this issue to be able to file Chapter 9. And the Illinois legislature hasn't done that. So Chicago can't even threaten it or raise it as a potential threat because the Illinois legislature has not given that tool in the toolbox.
So the mayor could say, well, I'm going to go to the governor and he's going to go to the legislature, the Illinois House, the Illinois Senate, the Democrats and Republicans, and see if he can pass this enabling legislation. If you want, we'll do that, and then he'll have, even if he doesn't invoke it, or even if Chicago doesn't, other cities don't, they'll have that leverage, right?
That's right. I'm not a politician. I'm a restructure and bankruptcy guy, and I'm sure there would be an outcry against what I'm suggesting, and people say I don't understand the politics and this is not a doable proposition. But the tendency of people in my world who come into my world, what I call it involuntarily rather than being a practitioner, is to compare something to an alternative that doesn't exist. I call it compared to what? If you compare it to nirvana, nirvana is you just pay all your bills, you don't have a problem, we have enough money, pensions are honored. If that's what you're comparing things to, of course you're not going to do anything different because you'll just go with nirvana. That's not the realistic alternative to compare it to. The realistic alternative to compare it to is things will keep getting worse, and then when this is taken on, inevitably at some point in time, the ability to deal with it and the pain, unfortunately, inflicted on various creditors, including pensioners and maybe bondholders and others, unfortunately, I think will be worse than if you took on the problem today and dealt with it more gradually.
Right, and so you got to convince these people around the table, we can get that, we can do that, and then you'll have fewer choices, and then we'll be dealing with a judge, and then we'll be dealing with a plan, and you won't be dealing just with me. And you guys will be organized, you'll have your committees, your representatives, but that'll be the process. So maybe you want to start negotiating now.
I would submit that it's a little bit help me, help you, because all the stakeholders, and sometimes you need to distinguish the leaders and the rank and file. The leaders don't want to do things to the rank and file that will upset them. Obviously, touching pensions is like a third rail, so that's a problem. But right now, the leaders have no particular reason to take on the issue because there isn't an alternative under Illinois law for Chicago to do something different like a Chapter 9.
Right, and so if you got that legislation, you'd have that lever, and perhaps the governor, the mayor of Chicago, the other mayors ought to be thinking about this as a way of having some more options and inducing people to come to the table.
Well, and I wouldn't do it just pass some legislation and see what happens. I'd have a plan. I'd probably, along with that, appoint a pension czar or some sort of commission and say your job is to, now that this authority exists, in a worst case, to go the Chapter 9 bankruptcy route, let's make sure that doesn't happen. Let's get a deal. You go out, look at the alternatives, run the numbers that have been run in the past, but let's do them maybe a little bit more realistically, and gather the parties, both individually and collectively, and say, how can we solve this with the least pain as possible and the most empathy possible to all of the people whose promises, the promises that have been made to them, unfortunately, may not be able to be lived up to, but live up to them as much as possible.
Can you give them any idea? Can you say, well, you know about Detroit. You say we're not Detroit. Detroit was in worse shape. They filed, what, in 2013? Is that about right?
Approximately.
And did they come out of bankruptcy a few years later?
They did, yes.
How bad was it? How many, on average, how much were the pensions cut? What percentage? You have any idea?
I have an idea, but that's, with respect, that's not the way, I can't answer the question in the way you asked it, because part of my point about there being empathy is when you get into situations like this, you look at, you don't look at averages. You look at the people who are in their 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, and you treat them differently because the people who are much younger have much more ability to deal with change, and the people who are much older don't. And you can come up with solutions that are less aggressive and less painful to the people that are basically very close or already into retirement, and the people that are much further away, unfortunately, probably would take some more pain, but have many more decades to adjust to deal with that.
So, folks, we've just concluded part one. We've been focusing on the city of Chicago and the city issues of this distressed process for the distressed governments, analogous to distressed companies, the insolvency, bankruptcy, all focusing on the city. We're going to turn at some point to the state of Illinois, and that's going to be part two of the show. Thank you for watching. Come back next week, see part two. And so you come back, and you come back next week and every week to Public Affairs.